I always thought loyalty meant something in this building. 18 years without a single HR complaint, without missing a deadline. 18 years of staying late to finish someone else's proposal, cleaning up financial reports that should have sunk a quarter, and quietly making sure mistakes never saw daylight. And then, at exactly 9:14 a.m. on a Thursday, the CEO's best friend walked into my office with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and said, "We're restructuring." He said it like it was a favor, like I should thank him for the privilege of being the first to know. My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 50 years old, and until that moment, I was Senior Vice President of Operations for a global supply chain analytics firm called Halverson Dynamics. I'd been here since the early days, when the office was a leased floor in a half-empty downtown tower. The logo was a piece of clip art, and the server room was just a closet with a desk fan in it. I'd helped steer this place through 3 recessions, a hostile takeover attempt, and the kind of boardroom bloodbath that usually ends up in trade journals. My hands were on everything that kept this company running smooth, and for most of those years, I believed that meant something. He didn't sit down, just leaned against the doorframe, like we were 2 old friends having a casual chat, though I'd never liked him. His name was Connor Hale, CEO's old college roommate, golf partner, and the kind of man who could remember his handicap to the decimal, but not the name of the receptionist he'd just met. He had that particular brand of easy confidence that only exists in people who've never had to earn a paycheck on their own merit. The kind that comes from knowing the world will bend to make room for you. "I know this isn't easy," he said, dragging out the word easy until it sounded like a dare. He told me my position was being eliminated, though the role itself would remain, with a new strategic focus under the guidance of someone he'd already picked. His transition plan consisted of me boxing up my office by the end of the day and handing over my key card. The kicker? The man replacing me was another golf buddy, mid-30s, unshaven, asked me during our one brief interaction if we did casual Fridays every day, and whether the vending machines carried craft beer. His first week here, he spent more time planning a company retreat than learning a single client name. While Connor talked, I looked at the blinds. They were half-drawn, letting in a thin stripe of light across my desk. It hit my coffee mug just enough to make the steam visible. Burnt coffee, reheated from an hour ago. Somewhere down the hall, the office printer was choking out a long report, the kind you can hear before you see. All these tiny familiar details felt sharper in that moment, like I was etching them into memory. When he was done with his corporate eulogy, I nodded once. No argument, no begging, no "after all I've done" speech. I just swiveled my chair toward the shelves, took down the framed awards and plaques, and started packing. One of them was for Exceptional Crisis Leadership, 2011, given after I'd kept a $1 million deal alive through a 2-week port strike. Another was a quiet commendation from the board for operational excellence. 3 words that had taken years off my life. I wrapped them in the same calm I'd used to dismantle late-night emergencies and impossible deadlines. Connor lingered a moment longer, maybe waiting for a reaction he could file away as unprofessional. When it didn't come, he tapped the doorframe twice and said, "Appreciate your understanding." Then he walked out, probably to meet his replacement hire for a round of drinks. I didn't look back at the desk once the box was full, just slid my personal laptop into my bag, tucked the pens I liked into the side pocket, and took a final glance at the whiteboard. Last week's to-do list was still there. Half of it crossed out, the other half waiting for me to finish. In the elevator, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls. Tie still straight, hair still neat, face unreadable. Years of training myself not to show the tension in the room when clients got heated or when a shipment went sideways and someone had to fix it fast. That skill was serving me now. Outside, the air was colder than I expected. I carried the box to my car, set it gently on the passenger seat, and sat for a moment with the engine off. I thought about 18 years of conference calls, site visits, and nights spent reviewing contracts in empty hotel rooms. About the people I'd hired and mentored, the systems I'd built that were still running without a hitch, and about how quickly all of that could be swept aside when someone decided their buddy needed a paycheck. When I finally started the car, I didn't point it toward home. I took a left instead, merging into traffic without looking at the rear view. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, something steadier. He thought I'd just vanish. He didn't know I'd been paying attention for almost 2 decades. When I first walked through the doors of Halverson Dynamics, we didn't even have a proper reception desk, just a folding table with a plastic plant, a cordless phone, and a stack of visitor badges in a cardboard box. The CEO at the time, before the title passed to his more politically gifted nephew, met me in the hallway, wearing rolled-up sleeves and a coffee stain on his tie. We had 12 employees, 2 paying clients, and a server that shut itself down if someone ran the microwave for too long. I came in as an operations consultant on a 6-month contract, tasked with streamlining processes. 6 months turned into a year, then 2. By the 3rd year, I was running the operations floor, and by the 5th, my name was on the executive roster. Those early days were chaos disguised as ambition. I remember staying until 2 in the morning with the tech lead, trying to recover data after a corrupted backup nearly wiped out the billing system. I remember building a vendor tracking matrix in a weekend because a shipment to our largest client was stuck in customs, and no one had a clue which documentation was missing. People like to think leadership is about vision statements and board meetings. It's not. It's knowing which problem will explode first and diffusing it before anyone hears the ticking. Before Halverson, I'd spent a decade in high-level operations consulting, parachuting into companies that were either bleeding money or about to. My specialty was risk assessment and forensic auditing, looking at an organization's books, processes, and culture like a crime scene to figure out where the next disaster would come from. Sometimes it was incompetence, sometimes greed. More often, it was the quiet rot that sets in when rules bend for the right people. I was good at spotting that rot. I just didn't realize how much of it I'd see here. Over the years, I learned to keep my eyes open and my mouth shut. I saw contracts awarded to firms that had nothing but a shared golf course membership with the CEO. Watched promotions go to people whose only qualification was a seat at the right dinner table. There was always a reason, always a justification, and it was never worth calling out unless you had the evidence to make it stick. One year, during the run-up to a major acquisition, I stumbled on an anomaly in the compliance review. It was small at first, a mismatch between a vendor's invoicing and the terms of their service contract. But small things have a way of leading to bigger ones. I dug deeper, cross-referencing shipment logs, customs declarations, and a handful of internal memos. The picture that emerged wasn't pretty. If it had gone public, the resulting investigation would have tanked the acquisition, cost us millions in penalties, and gutted our market credibility. I brought it quietly to the CFO, fixed the operational gaps, and built new safeguards into our processes. The board congratulated him publicly for navigating a challenging compliance environment. My name never came up. That didn't bother me as much as it should have. In my line of work, disappearing from the narrative was a skill, not a punishment. But it taught me something. If I wanted the truth to survive here, I'd have to be its only archivist. So I started keeping copies of emails, contracts, vendor histories, performance metrics. Not because I planned to use them, but because I understood how quickly stories get rewritten in boardrooms. I encrypted the files, stored them off-site, and updated them weekly. Every anomaly, every suspicious deal, every quiet resignation that didn't make the press release. Over time, it became second nature. That habit bled into the rest of my work. If a project was heading for disaster, I documented the warning signs before anyone asked. If a department head fudged numbers to make a quarter look better, I kept the original reports. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was building a map, one that showed how this place really worked beneath the polished language of investor calls and press kits. And if you keep a map long enough, you start seeing the patterns no one else notices. The CEO's nephew came into power about 7 years ago, and with him came Connor Hale. The pattern shifted then. More contracts routed through personal connections, more leadership roles filled with familiar faces from country clubs and charity boards. On paper, everything still looked fine. In practice, the margin for error was shrinking. I saw it. I logged it. I said nothing. People sometimes assume that kind of vigilance is paranoia. They imagine you spend every day looking over your shoulder, expecting the knife. That's not it. It's habit. It's counting the exits when you walk into a room, noting who sits where, who speaks, who stays silent. It's storing details away because you've seen what happens when no one does. It's a quiet discipline, and like any discipline, you don't turn it off just because things are comfortable. For 18 years, I watched this company grow from a cramped office with flickering lights to a glass and steel tower with our name on the skyline. I was proud of that, even when I disagreed with the path we took to get there. But I never forgot what I'd learned before I got here. Success doesn't erase vulnerability. It just hides it better. And now, sitting in the driver's seat with a box of awards beside me and Connor Hale's smug smile still fresh in my mind, I realized something. Every file I'd kept, every pattern I'd traced, every quiet note I'd made over the years, it wasn't just a record. It was a way out. It was never paranoia. It was habit. And now, habit was going to become my exit strategy. The new guy arrived 2 days after I cleared out my office, a grin and a handshake wrapped in a blazer that still had the tailor's chalk on the vent. His name was Brett Maddox, though he introduced himself like we were starting a podcast together. Leaning in, elbows on my old desk, voice loud enough to command attention and loose enough to leak it. "We're shaking the dust off," he said to the operations team during his first all hands. "No more red tape. Trust your gut." The veteran in procurement told me later he said it twice, like a mantra. Trust your gut. At Halverson, guts were fine for lunch. We used protocols for everything else. By the end of week 1, Brett had overridden vendor vetting and greenlit a glossy strategic partner with a 5-page website full of stock photos. The rate sheet he approved was 20% above market, backdated to make it retroactive, and paid through a third-party aggregator that specialized in flexible remittances. I knew those words. I'd spent a decade translating them into risk. He bragged about the deal at the espresso machine, telling a sales director the new partner would grease the skids on customs holds. He said it like a life hack. He said it loud enough for a visiting analyst from a client to hear. The leaks didn't stop there. He let a roadmap slip over cocktails, told a vendor's rep where we were expanding before we filed anything publicly, then asked if they had a corporate box at the arena. He joked about our margins at a networking breakfast, named a client that was late on invoices, and called it friendly heat. If I'd tried to script a compliance training video about what not to do, I wouldn't have written it this on the nose. My phone started ringing. Not the number I'd left with HR, the one only a few people had. Former colleagues reached out under the pretense of catching up, then let the mask slip. Morale had cratered. Senior project managers were taking sick days in clusters. Operations coordinators were being told to push shipments out without confirming paperwork because leadership wants to be scrappy. Key clients were noticing. One hinted they were considering an RFP to benchmark alternatives, which is corporate for we're shopping. The ones who trusted me spoke quietly, like they were afraid the vents had ears. Maybe they did. Distance did something useful to my vision. From the outside, the patterns glowed. I pulled public procurement filings, sifted through customs bulletins, checked the state's corporate registry for any shell entities that looked like they'd been assembled by a bored paralegal. I flagged 3 with familiar surnames and a shared registered agent. I cross-referenced our press releases with a schedule of investor calls and noticed how often Brett's wins landed immediately before public updates. I listened in on the next call and heard the careful cadence of a promise you can't quite keep. He talked synergies, speed, and unlocking operational agility, a phrase that usually means someone has decided guardrails are optional. At an industry conference in Phoenix, I planted myself near the hallway outside a sponsored panel and nursed a bad coffee long enough to hear 2 vendor reps gossip about a friend of Connor's, offering priority lane access if they could bundle loyalty. They spoke in the lazy shorthand of people who have never been burned. I didn't correct them. I just filed the names, the time, the exhibit number. Later, at the evening mixer, Brett held court in a circle of admirers, spinning a story about a miracle reroute he'd pulled off with a couple of friendly phone calls. He laughed too loudly at his own punchline. The people around him laughed too, the way you laugh when money is nearby and you don't care where it came from. Through all of this, one name anchored the noise: Maya Chen. I'd hired her 3 years ago after she demolished a case study that had stumped every candidate before her. She was precise, understated, allergic to shortcuts. She texted me late one night, "Are you up?" Then, "They're pushing through a vendor exemption for Maddox. I'm listed as the approver because of a workflow glitch. He told me to just click it and we'll fix the paperwork later." I stared at the phone and felt the old coil tighten in my chest. I told her not to sign anything she couldn't defend in a room full of lawyers and to document every ask. I didn't add that I'd already started a folder with her name on it, not for retaliation, for protection. I switched routes on my morning run and cut past our headquarters just as the sun was hitting the glass. The lobby lights were on, and I could see 2 figures in the atrium: Brett, gesturing large, and Connor, hands in pockets, the posture of a man who never has to carry anything heavy. In my head, I drew the lines: deals to friends, friends to contracts, contracts to pressure, pressure to shortcuts, shortcuts to investigations, investigations to scapegoats. On that list, the scapegoat usually sits low enough on the org chart to be easily replaced and high enough to sign things. That was Maya. I kept listening. Quarterly call transcripts, trade publications, company Slack screenshots forwarded by people who still believed in what we built. The phrase "move fast" surfaced too often, paired with "don't overthink" and "we'll normalize this later." I tracked purchase orders. A pattern emerged where the amounts hovered just below the threshold that triggered automatic compliance review. That trick has whiskers on it. It's the corporate version of structuring your bank deposits to avoid scrutiny. I ran a side-by-side of approved vendors over 18 months and circled the ones that appeared only after Connor's weekend trips. There were enough overlaps to make a mosaic. I cross-checked their owners with a charity board roster and a private club membership list that had leaked in a society page write-up. I wasn't surprised by what traced back. I was only surprised by how sloppy it was. Maya called again. Her voice was steady, brittle at the edges. A client had noticed a discrepancy in a fulfillment timeline. Brett told her to massage the timeline. She didn't. He CC'd her on an email that changed the story anyway. I told her to forward the original chain to her personal address, then export the metadata. I could hear her hesitation through the static. "Is this normal?" she asked. I told her, "Normal is whatever you can explain without changing your heartbeat." I didn't sleep much that week. Not because I was angry, because the math was simple now, and the sum was dangerous. People like Brett don't fall alone. They drag the careful ones down with them and call it collateral. So I started arranging the pieces. Not dramatic moves, no anonymous tips, no rants online. Just pressure and light. Records aligned in narrative order. Public filings matched to private behavior. Timelines printed clean, color-coded, so a board member could understand them without calling an intern. I wasn't sharpening a knife. I was opening a window, not for revenge, to let the truth introduce itself. Getting into the boardroom wasn't hard. I'd spent years helping these people out of holes they didn't even know they'd dug, and I still had enough credibility in certain corners to get a seat under the right pretext. This time, it was a strategic consultation on a pending merger, my name buried in the meeting agenda as an external operations advisor. Nobody asked why the guy who'd been restructured was suddenly welcome at the quarterly, and I didn't volunteer the story. Sometimes the less said, the longer you stay in the room. Halverson's boardroom hadn't changed since my tenure. Same horseshoe table, same view of the skyline through floor-to-ceiling glass. The arrangement was deliberate. Positions told you everything about loyalty and leverage. On the far curve sat the old guard. Directors who'd been here before the IPO, careful with their words, suspicious of anything that smelled like unnecessary risk. To their right, the newer faces, investors who'd bought in during the growth spurt, chasing aggressive returns, loyal to whoever promised the most upside. At the head, the CEO, posture straight, face unreadable, and one seat over, where he could lean in and whisper between topics, was Connor Hale. Smiling like the king of the table, legs crossed, cufflinks catching the light. I took the open seat halfway down, close enough to see the micro-reactions, far enough to avoid being boxed in. A few heads nodded in acknowledgement. Others barely registered I was there. That was fine. I wasn't here for the pleasantries. I let the first hour run its course. Earnings recaps, merger projections, a slideshow of upward-pointing arrows. Connor chimed in twice, both times to add color to Brett's recent vendor expansions. He made it sound visionary, almost philanthropic. When my turn came, I kept my voice even. I was asked to provide operational insights related to the merger's risk profile. I began, sliding a binder onto the table. Black cover, no labels. I opened it to the first tab and rotated it toward the center so everyone could see. In the course of preparing my analysis, I reviewed certain internal transactions from the past quarter. Page 1 was a simple chart. Vendor names, approval dates, payment amounts. I didn't editorialize. The numbers spoke first. Several of the vendors had matching registered agents and P.O. boxes in the same suburban strip mall. A few directors leaned in, frowning. I flipped to the next tab. Budget reallocations from core operations to strategic partnerships, approved outside the normal cycle. Some signed on a Friday night. time-stamped after business hours. The sums weren't astronomical, but they were precise, each just under the threshold that required full board review. This, I said, tapping one of the line items, was processed 11 days after the contract was signed. The service it paid for was delivered 3 weeks before the contract existed. Connor shifted in his chair. "I'm sure there's context for all of this," he said, voice easy, hands open. "We're in a period of adaptation. Sometimes you have to move fast, make exceptions." I cut him off before he could finish. Exceptions don't come with backdated invoices and third-party routing, unless someone's trying to hide the path. I turned another page, revealing scanned copies of signed purchase orders. Each was initialed by Brett. On 2, the counter-signature belonged to Connor himself. Alongside them, I'd printed public registry records linking the vendor owners to the same golf club and charity board Connor frequented. The air in the room shifted. Whispers spread along the curve of the table. One of the older directors adjusted his glasses and studied the page like it might combust. The CEO's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. I kept going. During the first month of the new leadership transition, there were 3 compliance triggers related to international shipments. All were marked resolved in the system within 24 hours, without documentation of corrective action. I cross-referenced the shipment IDs. 2 involved vendors we'd never vetted before this quarter. I slid another page forward. Email headers showing Brett directing staff to fast-track those shipments, copied to Connor. Connor gave a short laugh. "This is starting to sound like sour grapes, Daniel. You were let go. Understandably, that stings. But to sit here and—" "This isn't about me," I said, locking eyes with him. "It's about a paper trail you can't explain away over cocktails." I flipped the last tab. Here are the flagged financial transactions. 8 payments routed through an intermediary registered overseas. The intermediary account holder also happens to be a minority stakeholder in one of our acquisition targets. Silence landed heavy. Nobody moved. The weight in the room was no longer about me being an outsider. It was about the fact that every page in front of them was verifiable. I'd kept the explanations minimal, the connections clear enough that anyone could trace them, without asking me to fill in gaps. The CEO finally spoke, voice low. "Daniel, thank you. We'll review this immediately." One of the senior directors cleared his throat. "I move for an immediate closed session," he said, eyes fixed on the chair at the head of the table. "Without management present." The CEO looked at Connor, then at me. No words, just a nod to the corporate secretary, who began shuffling papers to mark the change in session. I closed the binder, left it in the center of the table, and stood. No one stopped me. I didn't glance back at Connor as I walked to the door, but I could feel his stare. Sharp, calculating, maybe even rattled. That was fine. My part was done. The truth was sitting there in black and white, and it no longer belonged to me. My phone buzzed just after 10 that night, a low vibration against the desk that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet of my apartment. I almost didn't check it. When I finally did, the message lit up the screen in white letters. "What did you do?" "They fired him. The board is furious. No signature. But I didn't need one." Maya always got straight to the point. I stared at the words for a moment, letting them settle. The weight I'd been carrying for weeks didn't vanish, but it shifted, enough to breathe differently. I typed nothing back. Sometimes a blank reply says more than a sentence. By morning, the ripples had already started to surface. A trade publication ran a brief citing internal restructuring and strategic misalignment. No names, no details, just the kind of language meant to make people move on without asking questions. But 2 days later, another outlet dug deeper. The CEO's best friend was out, effective immediately, and an independent review had been commissioned to assess recent vendor contracts. It wasn't front-page news, not yet, but I recognized the tone of the piece. Someone in that boardroom wanted this to be known. By the end of the week, I heard whispers of SEC interest. Not an official statement, just quiet inquiries into payment routing and vendor affiliations. That's how it always starts, low and careful, looking for something that justifies turning up the volume. I didn't need confirmation to know the investigation had teeth. The binder I'd left on the table wasn't a final blow. It was a door left open. All they had to do was walk through it. I spent most of those days on foot, moving through the city at night without a destination. Streetlights pooled gold on wet pavement. Neon signs bled into rain-streaked glass. The air carried the smell of roasted chestnuts from a cart near the corner, mixed with exhaust and the faint metallic tang that comes before another storm. People hurried past, heads down, lost in their own calculations. I didn't feel like celebrating. There were no champagne corks in my mind, no mental toasts to victory. What happened wasn't about winning. It was about stopping something before it could consume the people who didn't deserve to be caught in its gears. On the fourth night, I sent a single text. Meet me tomorrow. Same place as last time. The cafe hadn't changed. Narrow front window, the smell of dark roast and warm bread, the low murmur of conversations that belonged to other lives. Maya was already at a corner table, a mug between her hands. She looked tired, but steady. When I sat down, she didn't waste time. They told me Brett resigned for personal reasons, she said. Connor's gone. Nobody's saying why, but the mood in the office. It's different. Lighter. She studied me for a moment. I know it was you. I didn't confirm it. I just reached into my coat and set a small black USB drive on the table, pushing it toward her with 2 fingers. Everything I didn't use, I said. Contracts, approvals, internal notes. If anything like this happens again, you'll see it before it spreads. She didn't touch it right away, just looked at it like it might burn. Stay sharp, I added. Stay clean. Don't let anyone rush you into a corner where you have to choose between your job and your name. She finally took the drive, sliding it into her bag. Why give this to me? She asked. Because you'll use it for the right reasons, I said. That was all the explanation she needed. We finished our coffee mostly in silence, the kind that's not awkward, but built from shared understanding. When we left, she went one way, I went the other. No handshakes, no goodbyes. Walking back through the cold, I thought about loyalty and betrayal, and how often they're separated by nothing more than timing. 18 years I'd given to that place, believing the work would speak for itself. In the end, it wasn't the work that spoke. It was the evidence, the patterns, the silence that let the truth stand without my voice pushing it forward. Silence has its own kind of volume, and when you learn to use it, it can be deafening. I know they'll never thank me. That's fine. My work is done, the second the truth speaks for itself. And tonight, it's talking louder than they ever expected.